Good evening, fellow heretics. Welcome to Nerds and Heresy. We have a very special guest tonight who's waiting for us backstage, Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh, who is the author of The Origins of Early Christian Literature, which I highly recommend. It's very fun, and I'm very excited to pick her brain about it because I have so many questions. So before we get to that, let's bring her on stage.
Hold on to your butts.
Thank you, Derek. Hello,
That was
Dr.
the
Walsh.
greatest opening. Hi, how
like
are
that?
you? Thanks for having me. I did, and it's funny. Like that's like the most banging opening ever. And I'm waiting for my husband to like bring me in a baby monitor. So it just kind of like reminds me of like concerts I went to 20 years ago, like compared to what I'm doing on a weekend evening now. But
Yeah.
that was great.
My favorite part of my stream is that 1 minute countdown. It's all downhill from there. So sorry to.
Oh, okay. Well,
But,
that's. I mean, that
we'll
was
get through it
pretty.
together.
That was pretty peak. Yeah, we will. Thanks for having me.
So, Dr. Walsh, can you give us a bit of background on who you are, what your specialty is, what you got going on, where people could find you, etc. By the way, everybody watching,
Sure.
hello, and you can find all the links to Dr. Walsh's websites and goings on the internet in the description below. But yeah, Dr. Walsh, take it away, please.
Sure. So I'm an associate professor at the University of Miami. That's kind of my day job. And you mentioned my book, so that's kind of the most recent thing to publicize.
Oh, you mean this book right here?
Yeah, that's the one. Working on part 2 right now. It's kind of like a sequel, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But the book is kind of the thing that ended up putting me. Yeah, sure. It's put me kind of on the internet, I guess, which was a surprise because, you know, I just wrote the book because you're supposed to write a book, and I had certainly worked on it for a while, but I didn't expect anybody to like it or believe me. So it's been kind of nice to not only get some attention for the book, but also like to have so many people who are not academics like the book. That was really, that's been fantastic. So again, really thank you for having me on here to have these conversations. And then the other things to plug, I suppose, are I've been doing some courses with Derek at Myth Vision on MVP courses, which if you go to my website, robynfaithwalsh.com, there's a link there. And I've also started an initiative with Dr. Canada Moss and Dr. Dan McClellan. We call it Didaskaloi. Thank you. So Didaskaloi, the book Didaskaloi, and under Teaching 2, you'll find the MVP courses. So all of that is available for, you know, various levels of interaction or engagement with my materials if you want. So I think that's pretty much the plug. I have a course right now on Paul that's up on MVP courses, and we have one on the Gospels that's in the can, I guess you would say, and I finished all of the text for it, so it should be available soon.
That is very exciting stuff. Yeah, your book it's not very long, and it's not super heady. Like it's very readable for the common audience. But at the same time, like I do have a bit of an education in this topic, but I still got a whole lot out of this that I didn't get before. So yeah, it's can't recommend it enough. It's a very fun read. There's a lot of things that I'm just like, wait, what? Why did I never think of that before? Yeah, so in the book, you know what? Here's what we're gonna do. Oops, I've got some things prepared. Give me a second. Also, hi, chat, everybody.
Yeah, I'm looking at the comments. Hi, Benjamin. Yeah. Hi.
If anyone watching has any questions for Dr. Walsh, please feel free to ask. They don't have to be super chats, but I won't complain if they are. Yeah, please help me keep the conversation going because I don't have my co-host with me, who's much better at that than I am. So we're going to start with a quote from your book. In short, the Gospels represent the strategic choices of educated Greco-Roman writers working within a circumscribed field of literary production. It is this social network of literary culture producers that we should examine in our scholarship, aiming for descriptions that are both practical and plausible, given the kind of social engagement and expertise we know to be typical of such specialists. I really enjoyed you using the word specialists at the end there.
Yeah.
Because we don't often think of the authors of the Gospels as specialists. We think of them as eyewitnesses or maybe historians or something, but they're not. They're specialists in something completely different. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah.
Who were the authors of the Gospel?
Yeah, that's actually
yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. No, I was going to say that's kind of what I'm trying to get at in book 2, which I mentioned we could talk about as well, because I have to spend so much time in that book trying to deconstruct the way we traditionally talk about these gospel authors that, I had to make some choices along the way. I can tell you actually just, I'll get to the question about the specialists in 1 second, but, I rewrote this book 3 times before I published it, because I wrote a 200-page version talking about how the gospel authors interacted with each other as authors. And then my dissertation advisor at the time said, I had a different idea for a dissertation. He was like, I don't know why you don't just turn this into a dissertation. So then I rewrote it again. I scrapped that first version, rewrote it again, because I wanted to talk about why the field was so funky in the way that it approached the gospel authors, the idea that they're not specialists, that is people who are fairly highly educated, who have these really, in the ancient world, unique skills of being able to read and write, which they're clearly doing. I mean, obviously they're writing, but they're also reading each other. They're critiquing each other. They're making editorial choices. They're reading all kinds of, obviously they're reading Jewish literature, but they're also reading other Greco-Roman literature that often got diminished, I thought, in a lot of scholarship. So I wanted to try to figure out why they were treated so strangely. And so I scrapped the first version, wrote the second one with an emphasis on the history of the field. And what I decided to argue is that really there was this romantic idea of the author that was happening with the way that New Testament scholarship was approaching the question of the Gospels. And I thought it was very much anchored in this idea that, well, they're not specialists per se, even though we know a ton about what it took to be educated and trained at the level that we see the Greek and the engagement with literature that the Gospel authors are actually participating in. That was fairly specialized activity. So we're not focusing on that. They were focusing, or scholarship was tending to focus on, well, how do we get the historical Jesus out of this? How do we get historical early Christian communities out of these texts? Mostly because we didn't have a lot of evidence, or I would say we have evidence that people don't tend to like, for example, the letters of Paul, because Paul never met Jesus, right? So whatever he provides for us is very much idiosyncratic to his own methods and means. And so I had the feeling that people were really reading into who these gospel authors were and creating lots of special exceptions within scholarship to say, like, well, this must be oral tradition, this must be community composition. A lot of books out there, and I'm not trying to, critique anybody, because, everybody participates in the trends of their field at the time. There'll be things that come out about my book, critiques that show my situatedness as well at some point. But there were lots of books that would come out and say, the most obvious one that comes to mind is like, well, Matthew says a lot of things that are kind of, you can construe as like against the synagogue or against like Jewish leaders. So he must be mad at the synagogue, or like the Matthean community must have left the synagogue and they're angry. And I used to just think to myself, how in the world do you know that? So the book
stretching a little bit there.
Whenever it's felt like two steps were like Kevin Bacon, like if it was like two Kevin Bacons of like rationality like removed from, I was like, why are we doing this? So the idea of the author as a specialist, I just wanted to write a book where I said, okay, like pretend I don't know Christianity still exists, pretend I just found these texts and I'm making sense of them, and I know that there was a Jesus cult, or whatever you want to call it, that developed in the first century, Jesus movement. I know these texts are about Jesus. let me look at how we tend to look at things in philosophy, how we treat other kinds of creative literature, and how we treat other kinds of ancient authors, without saying, like this one author must have a whole community around them. What would I say about them instead? And basically I got down to like, well, I see a lot of, at the very least, filling in the blanks here going on with things like empty tomb motifs, or, I go through the book, a bunch of things in the Gospels that people struggle to try to make sense of historically, when you see tons of examples, hundreds in some cases of examples in broader Greco-Roman literature of unique birth narratives. I have a class right now called the Greco-Roman Context of Early Christianity. I won't even let the students read the New Testament. I'm just making them read things around the New Testament that are contemporaneous. Ooh. And then I'll give them they're mad at me. They don't like it. But I give them a little snippet.
Oh, I would love that. Are you kidding?
Yeah, they'll appreciate me later. But I'm giving them things like, like Augustus's birth narrative, or I have to look up who it was, but somebody, one philosopher who's looking for followers among the fishermen. This stuff existed. These narratives existed so broadly that when you start to look at the Gospels, you're like, this fits right in, And so why I would think that these authors have to magically be writing for communities really doesn't quite make sense. What you actually have is something that's very interesting, which is an account that's been preserved of this biography of an ancient philosopher, wonder worker, and you have multiple versions of writers sort of writing and overwriting each other's stories. And so I thought that was a much more interesting approach that treated them like the specialists that they were.
Interesting.
Oh, yeah. Benjamin. Well, wait a second. Benjamin's right. They did have communities, but other authors. Exactly right. Not religious communities. Yeah.
Gotcha. Real quick, there was another question I saw. There it is.
Or the Astros.
Bit off topic, but we'll knock it out real
not
quick.
For me.
You were worse historically, the German romantics or the Astros?
I mean, the romantics, because but yeah, somebody's got to have me on a baseball podcast, please. Somebody out there. The romantics is the correct answer, although I understand why you asked me about the Astros. Yeah, I'm a major baseball nerd. That's my other thing I'm doing when I'm not reading ancient stuff.
Oh, did not know that.
Yeah.
So how did education work in the ancient world for people who are writing things like this? Because we know, the Jesus' disciples were fishermen, tax collectors, alleged physicians of some kind or another, none of which are probably able to write on this level. So how did authors like this become educated? Because you didn't, I don't know, was it the Shepherd of Hermes says he was a slave, but he offered to copy. So you didn't have to be of royalty, like some people seem to think. You could be a slave and somehow have the education to do this.
Yeah,
some accounts of that. So
no, that's a very important point.
Yeah.
Yep. So one thing that I try to be careful about in the book is to say, and I think I say it in the introduction, and I kind of pepper it throughout. When I talk about elite cultural producers or literate cultural producers, the second I use the word elite, and because we know literature is relatively rarefied, being able to produce and read literature is rarefied, people automatically think rich people. But that's not the case in the ancient world.
Right.
It's definitely the case that you can be highly educated because you're enslaved. I mentioned Epictetus, who is a former slave and becomes a famous philosopher in the book, but I didn't really get into that aspect. So before I even go on, I want to recommend the work of Canada Moss, who has a book forthcoming called God's Ghostwriters, which talks about enslaved persons who are also highly educated. I know this book is just going to blow everything up. It's amazing.
Oh, man.
And so I think her work is an important correction or addition to what I'm about to say, because I don't get into that idea of enslavement as much as I probably should have in the book. But you have a couple things going on with the gospel authors. So number one, when I say elite cultural producer, literate cultural producer, what I mean is somebody who's part of let's say or 5%. Some people will say it's closer to like 10-20% of the ancient world, but usually that incorporates people who can like sign their name or write a receipt, which is not the same thing as reading and writing literature. So I tend to date it a little, or put the number a little bit, under 10% of people can do this in antiquity, and their social context has a lot to do with, how good they are at it, but also, how advanced are they in ancient schooling, which is called paideia. And what you have with the gospel writers is somebody who is not at the pinnacle of paideia, meaning for whatever reason, they have not gone to school long enough so that they're absolute masters of the language. But there are a few people who were, even fewer people who were at that level. Thinking here about someone like a Virgil. I know we're talking Latin, but somebody who is at that very high level. You also have relatively few, comparatively extant authors writing in Koine Greek, which is what the gospel authors are writing in, which is more of a sort of common Greek that
it's like street Greek kind
of, what happens is Alexander the Great, after he unifies everybody, there were all these different dialects. And so Koine Greek kind of becomes like the one Greek everybody can sort of figure out, like everybody can more or less communicate in that style of Greek. But it is a little bit, it's not that high, like formal Greek of some of the, great canons of Greek literature. And so then you're left with questions like, okay, what was going on with Mark? Because if you read his Greek, he's very repetitive. The sentence structure is very simple. It kind of looks like another kind of text that circulated in the ancient world that was called paradoxography, which tended to be sort of these short, almost pithy might be the wrong word, but like these little vignettes on talking about miracle stories from the ancient world. And that really kind of fits the bill in some ways for what you're finding in the Gospels. But he also does a lot of weird things in the Greek, like a little bit of strange sentence structure. And also he sometimes has certain Latin words that he kind of Greekifies certain Latin words. And you're like, why is he doing that? So like, it may be that this guy's, his first language is not Greek. Yeah, but who knows, right? Like I hate those kind of speculative ideas, but something's going on there where like something with his education, like there's not a great facility here. And even though like we're dealing with like copies of copies, to the extent that's been preserved, there's still coherence to the text and his voice as an author, but it's a little disjointed. So these gospel authors, Luke is very, very good. He's kind of at the level of a Greek novel, but he's still not writing an epic, in the way, he's kind of striving to do that. It's not super, super polished. But each one of these guys, they're kind of doing their best work. And I think anybody who's able to write anything along these lines is part of that tier. So ancient education, I would say the things to keep in mind that are important for us are you had to have a certain amount of leisure time and to learn, to go to school, to practice, to master, quote unquote, the language. And whether, I don't mean to say leisure time in the sense of just like, kicking back and enjoying yourself. Somebody might have been forced to do this, per our conversation about enslavement.
Time where you're not making bricks, time in between brick making.
To stay alive, right? Yeah, you're not a subsistence farmer. You, for whatever reason within your social context, are able to spend the time to learn the language and learn how to write, because otherwise you're in the fields. Otherwise you're fishing for your life, like you're trying to
literally
survive.
From dusk till dawn. Like you're working nonstop. That's your whole life.
Or you're running a shop, or you're a baker, or, you're in the artisan class. You're not able to just kind of kick back. And so that's who we're talking about, is somebody. And so now the question becomes, okay, what is the specific social context? That's something that, I am playing with in the next book, but I stayed away from in this one because I don't like the speculation, because it very quickly becomes like the slippery slope of starting to make claims about who these guys were. And I'm not sure we will ever be able to reconstruct that fully. And so I try to stay away from any of those arguments that say like, and so clearly they were, that kind of mirror reading of like, now we know that they were like part of the synagogue, back to that Matthean argument, right? I tried to stay away from any of that because I just don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know. But I tried to keep it to what do I know about ancient education, what it takes to write and publish a piece, and what I see evident in these texts for that literate community that they're a part of.
Yeah. And even still, like, even if you did like reach a higher level of education, and as far as like literacy or high level literacy words, that's still very different from being a scribe. Like being a scribe was like a league of its own. It was its own trade. You got to be trained to be a professional scribe. If you were just literate, you could write down and copy things, but you weren't like trained on the level of a professional scribe, so you'd make a lot of mistakes. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting research about scribes, and somebody who's worked on this, Sarah Rollins, Bill Arnall. There was a moment for a few years there where there's a fair amount of scholarship being like, well, we don't want to say they're elites. We don't want to say they're like rich guys, but we know they had to have a fair amount of education. So maybe they were scribes. And I felt like it was kind of an attempt to keep them like,
okay.
Like scribes are kind of a little bit, or like at least keep them at a tier. I think there's a tendency to like assume, well, any early Christian follower had to be kind of in a lower tier of society. Because we imagine that from the Gospels, Jesus's followers were, peasant class. Even though we know that's not necessarily the case from Paul's letters, but it's another one of those like romantic fantasies about early Christianity that I think persist. And so the scribe was kind of a sweet spot where you didn't have to admit that they were like super educated, but they were like, like still kind of working class. And I have to think more about the scribe issue because I did research it for the book. And I couldn't get myself away from the idea that like people are trying too hard to make the scribe fit. But I could be maybe convinced otherwise. But scribes tended to, again, very sort of specialized knowledge or precise knowledge in their training, depending on what they're there for. So if a scribe is there to kind of, copy a text, for example, they didn't necessarily have to know what they were looking at to copy it. You just had to be a good copyist. You didn't have to actually read it. So that kind of thing becomes a little more complicated when it comes to scribes.
Yeah, again, in the Shepherd of Hermes, what didn't he say? I have to. He said he's copying a book, a religious text. I'm trying to remember, he got from an old woman, and he said he had to copy like one syllable at a time because he couldn't distinguish the difference, he couldn't distinguish the syllables because he was at the time they're writing in what's called Scriptura Continuum.
Scriptio Continua,
right?
Yeah, Continua, Scriptio Continua,
Scriptio Continuum, yeah. It sounds like a Harry Potter spell, but it's not.
It does.
This was a method of writing where there's Scriptio Continuum and all the letters just squished together. This was a method of writing where you didn't have spaces in between your letters. You didn't have margins. You literally filled up the paper. And one of the reasons this was done, for everyone watching, is papyrus was expensive. It wasn't like paper today. If you wanted to write something down, you had to fork over some coin in order to get papyrus. So you wanted to get as much as you could out of that piece of papyrus. So they would just fill every single corner and get rid of every single gap that they possibly could and write as small as they could. To get as much as they could out of that piece of papyrus. So that caused a lot of problems with early scribes, copyists.
Well, yeah, I mean, we even have some examples where like they clearly like lost their line of sight and repeated a line, like in Luke, like they there's like something missing because some scribe somewhere like, fell asleep or something. I don't know, just kind of like lost their.
Well, they would skip like an entire line or.
Yeah, definitely.
So what about this is good. How about historical standards from that time period? It's something I've been reading about the past couple of weeks. The historical standards are kind of all over the place. You have historians saying, hold on. Here we go. I prepared this. So here's a bunch of like references from historians. You have Josephus, who's saying even people who are eyewitnesses will change things for certain reasons. Cicero, this one I got from your book. He says, truth is not as important as making your friend sound good. Okay. All right.
Well, he writes to a friend and he says, like I know it's not true, but like, don't make me sound bad.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Like, just don't write that I have like 14-inch biceps. It doesn't matter if that's not true. You want to make me sound good. That kind of thing. And you have Thucydides, who's saying, if I had a hard time remembering certain details, and my colleagues did too. So we kind of did the best that we could to try and fill in those gaps. You had Diodorus, who says it's okay to paraphrase. If you're trying to write down a long speech, it's okay to paraphrase it for the purpose of keeping your audience's attention. And there's a quote from Shepherd of Hermes. I copied letter for letter, for I could not make out the syllables. And there's Origen. I do not condemn them if they sometimes dealt freely with things that to the eye of history happened differently, or if they changed them so as to serve the mystical claims that they had in view. For example, they may speak of a thing that happened in a certain place as though it happened in another. And then there's education. Some considered having a formal education to be a good thing, like Origen. Truly, it is no evil to have been educated, for education is the way to virtue. It is no hindrance to the knowledge of God to have been educated. Rather, it is a help. But then you have, don't worry, I'm not going to read this whole thing. But you have from the life of Antony.
I think I quoted that one in the book, the St. Antony one.
You did. I got this from your book too. Yeah. Who is like, he didn't have any formal education. Thus, his theology was not corrupted. His theology is pure. So it's not like very much like an advocate for homeschooling. Like, you don't want to go to those woke colleges. See, he was raised here, like, so he's not corrupted by that education. So you have all these different historians and poets and everything writing, and they're trying to argue who's more authoritative, what's okay. So what do you think is, I don't even know the question I'm trying to ask here.
I
what standard do you think you see what I'm saying?
So
there's no standard. It's all over the place.
Well, no. I know exactly what you're putting together there. I'll start with the second part. So we'll do let's bracket eyewitnesses. Don't let me forget about the eyewitnesses. Because I think there are two different things going on. Basically, it's a whole other thing. What you start to see develop, to my mind, 2nd century and beyond, is more and more of this resistance to eggheads. So you're absolutely right. I have to confess, I like in these interviews to kind of give the backstory to when I was writing, I was totally thinking about the anti-ivory tower woke coastal elite kind of narrative, right? And a writer who writes about this is Fran Lebowitz, who she hasn't written a book in a long time, but when she was more active and she does a lot of interviews, she'll sometimes talk about how America hates smart people. We don't want to hear from universities. We don't want to hear from nerds. There's that maverick thing, and I think that's always been kind of part of American culture. The scrappy patriot who isn't part of an elite. And so that narrative is very familiar to all of us. And so it's not even quite homeschooling, although it ends up becoming that, but it becomes I have innate knowledge, I have street smarts. I don't need your book learning, formal knowledge. I know better because I just innately understand what's going on. Augustine makes the same claim, Life of Antony, I think I quoted in the book. So you start to see this narrative more and more often. You saw it actually as well, even before that, in literature with the Greek novel, where the protagonists were, Yes, I love the Scorsese Fran Lebowitz documentary. I will talk about Fran Lebowitz for like an hour. So maybe we can put that on the back burner too. Um,
Oh man,
but I
Benjamin, you're killing it with the questions today,
yeah,
man.
I know. See, this is the thing. Actually, this point about the founding fathers were all intellectuals. I mean, Benjamin Franklin and like electricity, like he invented a whole bunch of things all the time.
Yeah.
But there was this persona of like self-made maverick, and you see it in literature for like heroic stories. You see it increasingly in the biographies that these men put out about themselves as intellectuals. And it rhetorically, you see the work that it's doing, because you have to somehow assert yourself over people who are of the same class, education, tier, however you want to put it. And then, if you're claiming something about some kind of spiritual knowledge, well, you don't get spiritual knowledge in the classroom. You get spiritual knowledge from a different source, right? And especially in the ancient world, that's
15 days
from
of praying and fasting. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So of course you start to see this narrative about like, I don't need this book learning. Jesus didn't need it. He just went to the temple as a 12-year-old child and like already knew everything. But of course you had that narrative about Alexander the Great. You had that narrative about, right? Like all of these great figures that rhetorically becomes kind of the backstory. And so you have to really look at that, like, you have to understand what's going on rhetorically with that. And it's interesting to me that it's kind of never stopped in some cases, like at least transhistorically, transculturally, you do see this narrative quite a bit, even though it's not the case. And what's interesting is that, people who, I was actually even thinking more about, like, we do have a lot of intellectuals in our culture who did not have formal schooling. Fran Lebowitz got kicked out of high school. I can give like a list of people who never went to college, who became famous writers, etc. But that never really becomes majorly part of their narrative, or if it does, it doesn't hinder their ability to then engage in that high tier of literate society. They still know the cross references. They still know the literature. They still know the genre and what's expected of them to be able to be successful within that field. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there that relates to the eyewitness question insofar as about history. What the eyewitness quotes are getting across there is, there's a little bit of a tendency within New Testament to be like, but there were eyewitnesses, and then therefore XYZ must be true. There were eyewitnesses, therefore the testimony of, and it's always testimony of the gospel authors must be true. The problems with that are multiple. Whenever I have like pre-law students or something in a class and I tell them that this is the position of the field, they're like, but we all know eyewitnesses are notoriously wrong. They're either wrong, memory is faulty. Like, we know this from cognitive science. We have a tendency to construct our own narratives, and that memory is faulty. So in antiquity, they were aware of this. You would more often be like, I talked to somebody who was an eyewitness, because it gave kind of a patina of legitimacy to whatever you were saying. But everybody knew, that it was more or less kind of a fabrication of the circumstances, or that, behind the scenes, eyewitnesses were also fuzzy. So this is back to kind of the rhetoric that you would supply to something that's making a claim about history. You want to at least say that you talked to somebody who talked to somebody. Now, where this really gets into trouble is when you think about a historian like, say, Herodotus. Like, half the stuff he claims I can't even repeat because it's like too offensive and so totally wrong. But he claims, like,
I know
talked to an
exactly
eyewitness.
what you're talking about.
Yes, like he makes a lot of claims.
Yep.
Yeah, about like certain people, and that you're like, what?
So,
like,
the most racist stuff you can.
It's like the stuff that I've been trying to, I looked it up actually a few weeks ago. Like, I need an example here that's like not offensive but still clearly crazy, and I had one, and now it's escaping me at this hour. But I think there was one, like, he talked about, like,
there was he said that the Indians had
yeah, that's the one I was thinking of.
Ants. No, not that one. I'm being PG here.
He has one about sperm being a certain color.
Well, there's that one. The one I'm talking about is he said in in Persia, they had ants the size of foxes that they kept as pets in the palace.
That's a good one.
Who would like fetch
thank
gold
you
for them or something?
Me. Yep. And
yeah, so
then you would have things about like, in this particular territory, there were people with faces in their torsos. And you're like, like, yeah, eyewitness testimony. Thanks. Of course, like you can nuance this, like not in all cases is he claiming eyewitness testimony, etc. But generally speaking, if you're making any claims about people, places, moments in history, there is a tendency for the author to claim they spoke to eyewitnesses. Now, the thing that I want to make clear is if the traditional dating of the Gospels is correct, so generally people place it after the Jewish war. I do not place it at the time of the Jewish war. I'm getting more and more radical and pushing it later and later as my life goes on. Just it doesn't work to say like, well, Mark 13 sounds like it knows the fall of the temple, therefore Mark is written in 70. Like that's way too intense for me. And I'm happy to talk about dating, but it's pretty clear that these texts exist after the temple is gone for a variety of other reasons that we can also talk about. But keeping that in mind, it's conceivable somebody's still alive that you could talk to. But the other problem is I don't think we can underestimate the effects of war on these narratives insofar as that Jewish war, it was a total, they razed Jerusalem. And it was a total matter of dislocation. And the number of people and narratives that you would have lost as a result of that war make it really implausible that there were enough eyewitnesses with anything related to whatever we would call modernity reliable testimony. I think, again, not to dismiss it, because I don't want to make a overcorrection any other way. But I think we need to just be wary, because so many other authors will claim eyewitness testimony when then they proceed to tell us something absolutely fabulous. And in antiquity, history telling was not the same as our standards today. As long as you gave an impression, that was good enough. You give an impression of what someone was like or the things they did, that was good enough. You just want to convey that impression. That was the primary goal.
Yeah. And even still, the biggest problem, of course, is the Gospels don't claim eyewitness authorship. As much as they like to posit that with their,
No, Luke says I wasn't there. I talked to people. Yeah, I know that.
And Luke says he's writing to compete with other people who are writing the same thing, right?
Yeah, I know.
So it's like,
hence the book. Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
He's like, these other people are claiming they're getting their information from eyewitnesses, but I'm actually getting my information.
Well, he just says there's lots of versions out there. And this guy has paid me to do the best job I can. So I've read everything I can get my hands on. I've talked to some people who claim they know what was going on. And so now you've paid me to write a better version. Here you go. I know that there's been a move recently to say that, some of the places that John mentions in his gospel, they actually existed. Therefore, John must have been written before the temple fell and these things were still standing at the time. There's lots of reasons to question that kind of narrative as well. The reason I say that the Gospels must be after the war really is twofold. I mean, the most basic is that we just don't have any evidence, like any extant papyri until the 2nd century. So you have zero evidence that they existed in the first. But you can reasonably say like these are copies of copies of copies that we have, scraps that were found in a trash heap. So you can rewind that back a bit.
Sure.
And the church fathers I don't particularly like to use as evidence, particularly those that try to posit that they've read something that somebody wrote in the early 2nd century, but they're now writing 200 years later. But there does seem to be some discourse out there about like gospels floating around, right? So fine, that's great, but that's also 2nd century. So benefit of the doubt that these are first century
there's other
texts.
people writing gospels.
But when he uses that word existed before Christianity, and that word generally meant like good news, like literally good news, but like sometimes like reporting. So you see the word.
It was like usually in the context of like good news about a war, like the war is ending, and that was the gospel was that the war is over or we're winning the war or something like that.
Usually it was good news about like, I looked this up a few weeks ago, like it was in the Medea, like I'm coming back and I'm reporting on something that happened and like good news, like it's not bad. So it could be like war reporting. The other place I've seen it is there's an inscription in Asia Minor to Augustus from well before Jesus's time. I mean, well before like a decade before Jesus was born. And it does say like, Augustus is the savior of these people, and here's the gospel of why, he's such a great leader. So it does kind of mean, I guess, in a sense, testimony or good news about something more on the side of the political, I would say, usually in context. But that Paul's around saying, like, I have good news, like he's reporting about something that's happened that, at the time, the Jewish Messiah is supposed to be a warrior figure. So that kind of militaristic language doesn't surprise me too much. But I think probably more research needs to go into this. But yeah, the idea that I think by the time you get to the church fathers, when they say gospel, they mean an actual text. I think when Paul is writing, it probably just means talking about it the way that we see it in other contexts before the first century.
Yeah. So good question here from Claude Siminian. Did the authors have some spiritual experience they tried to put into their writings, or were they con artists writing to manipulate? Is that even a question historians can address, or pure speculation? That's a good question.
It's an excellent question.
What do you think, Dr. Walsh?
Yeah, it's so hard to psychologize these figures, and because I have a tendency, I think, to sound cynical, just because I try to have kind of this critical lens. I don't want to come out and say nobody had a spiritual experience and they're all just manipulating for, economic benefit or something along those lines, because I think people's motivations are far more complex. And, can I say, like, let me just go to Paul, because he's also, in a sense, an author with his letters, and he tells us a little bit more about his psychology, unlike the gospel authors. But he, tells people over and over that he's having these divination experiences of the risen Christ, and that's how he knows what he knows. And, on one hand, a lot of people claimed to have kind of a direct line with a deity in antiquity. Think about like the Delphic Oracle, right? Like people made this kind of claim all the time. So, does Paul make this claim because he got tired of his day job and realized he could be an influencer and make more money this way? Possibly. Possibly he's making this stuff up, but there are so many people in antiquity who seem to have the same kind of perspective, that they do have some kind of connection. So I always just try to keep in mind that when we're reading these texts, it's a different social kind of fabric, or a different kind of social valence, in the sense that, people seem to have had, not just Paul or these gospel writers, but people had some kind of relationship to these deities, like the Greco-Roman pantheon in general, as well as, Yahweh within Judaism. People clearly had connections. And then sometimes, like I do, because I'm outside of a religious tradition, and I hear Christian people like who have a strong connection to the church today they can speak in tongues, they have sincere feeling about their relationship to their God. I think that's all there. And so now, on the other hand, did they benefit economically? Possibly. Like that's another factor here.
Yeah, like both can be true, but two things can be true at once.
Exactly. And so that's kind of something I'm working on right now, which is, who would be Theophilus? Like who would someone like Theophilus have been? The guy who pays Luke to write his gospel? Like what's going on there? What kind of person would have been attracted to the Christian message, not just out of a pure sort of like, connection to the divine and sincere faith? We tend to use that word faith, which, as a historian, I don't know quite what to do with, because it's a very personal kind of claim. I can't evaluate it. But who's the kind of person who would fund this? Who's the kind of person who would be a patron? How could the Christ groups become successful? within that first, second century landscape, and what kind of people would gravitate towards it and maybe not be fully aware of their reasons for doing so. They may have social reasons, or reasons that relate to them wanting to get kind of attention or cultural cachet, because they're not maybe rich enough to be a patron of like a high deity the way that like the imperial family is, but they have enough money and clout to become the patron of someone like Paul, right? So I think that all of this kind of gets mixed together.
Interesting. Yeah, like I definitely think Paul had genuine experiences. They had methods of like inducing hallucination in the ancient world. Like anytime you read about people like Jesus or again the Shepherd
John the
Hermes,
Baptist.
John the Baptist, yeah, you go into the wilderness, you fast for 2 weeks, 3 weeks.
Unrefined honey makes you trip.
You deprave yourself of sleep. There's all these like different ways.
Yeah.
And that was, that was a way of like trying to invite the gods to come in and give you a vision of something in your time of need. So I think he genuinely believed what he believed. But yeah, there's a lot of like fellow edgelord atheists like myself who like to say that Paul was a con artist. I'm like, it's not that simple. Not at all. It's
well, what's so interesting about Paul? Yeah, the thing that kind of both helps and hurts that thesis is like he keeps describing these super apostles. Oh yeah, I know. I have something to say about monkey. He has these super apostles and opponents and people like that following around. Like he'll leave a territory and then he'll hear these super apostles come in and he gets all angry about it. Which just tells us that like Paul is like one of a number of guys doing this. And, somebody I really like on the subject actually is the ancient author Lucian, who talks about, especially if you have more of a cynical view of these things. He talks about this one guy, Peregrinus. So he has a text called Pascha Peregrinus, where he talks about this dude who wants to basically be an influencer, to use our contemporary language. So he keeps like kind of lily padding from one religious tradition or philosophy to another, trying to become a leader or trying to, inculcate himself. In part because he's on the lam. He's apparently being pursued by the law for a variety of different infractions. But for a while, he tries being a Christian because he views them as gullible. And so he joins a Christ group and like kind of makes himself like a big deal within the Christ group. But then like he gets exposed. Really? Yeah. And so then he keeps moving on.
I know what I'm reading all day tomorrow.
Yeah, no, it's so good. Lucian is so good. He's just the best. And then at the end, when like none of it works out, he goes to the Olympic Games and he sets himself on fire because he figures like at least if he kills himself that way, like he'll make the news. Basically, like everyone will remember him if he does that. Wow. So that's how the story ends. But so Lucian takes a very sort of, side-eye view of these kinds of figures. And he also, I think, has a text elsewhere about this guy. I think it's Alexander Abuntikos or something like that is his last name. But he claimed to have divination experiences of this snake god Glycon. And he had a animatronic snake puppet that apparently was run by a series of like he had hoses and like some kind of like water work thing that like made the snake puppet move. Yeah, this guy's awesome. So the snake would be like, wah! So you would like come and like ask the snake a question. And then the night before he would like take out the wax seals and like read all the, messages asking for like a divination answer. Or like an oracle answer, and then he would like close them up again. So then people would come into like he'd had this tent, that was like a labyrinth, and you'd walk through and you'd see the snake puppet like Rah! And like ask the snake a question, and the snake would go Rah! And then he would interpret it for you. So like Lucian takes a very like
I'm like just now hearing about this. What?
I know this guy's great. It's like the best stuff. If I had hit Lucian at a different stage in my life, I'd probably be a scholar. No, but he's so great. Jabba the Hutt. I love, it's totally Jabba the Hutt. But yeah, you would go and like, but this guy was clearly like, Lucian is a satirist. You know, he's Fran Lebowitz. He's trying to take like this cynical view of these things, but of course, in any of this kind of humor, there's a measure of truth, and so I think we have to take authors like this seriously. About monkey news, just to make sure we don't. So, yeah, there it is. So this is Carl Pilkington. So more pop culture references. So I was on Deep Drinks a while ago, and we realized that we have a mutual love for the Ricky Gervais, Carl Pilkington era of podcasts. So. Yeah, my son asked me if all monkeys were baby gorillas and did a gorilla fist thing at lunch yesterday. That was charmingly embarrassing. So that's my monkey news.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, Lucian's awesome.
So when it comes to the Gospels, we see so many parallels in other ancient writings. Hold on, I have another slide. So just as one example, in the Bacchae, you have a god who takes the form of a man, a virgin who raises a baby god. You have a land flowing with milk and honey. You have a temple of a priest or a temple of a god being destroyed by an earthquake and fire. So a lot of this sounds very similar to the Gospels, even though it's 400 years earlier. And of course, you talk about the Satyricon a lot in your. Hold on, where is that? I have that too. There it is. Well, this is the empty tomb. Yeah, you've got a bunch of these different narratives that sound so similar. I don't even have
always my favorite.
Yeah. Oh, do you want to tell your story about the Widow of Ephesus? I got this one.
Oh God. Yeah, so this story apparently the backstory to this is I was at a classics library reading the Satyricon just kind of randomly, and I was like, oh my God, this is just like the Gospels. You know, why hasn't anybody taught me this? There must be 10,000 articles. And so I started, because I was at a classics library, you know, researching for the book. I started looking around. I'm like, why has nobody talked about it? I could find like 3 people. And so then I think it started to become, because something like Widow of Ephesus was just, it's a little salacious. I'll describe it in a second. I think people were like, well, the Gospels are religious.
Oh, there's some wild stuff in the Satyricon.
Yeah, it can't be like the Satyricon. Mm-hmm. And then I also started digging some more and realized, you know, this is Satyricons often attributed to this guy Petronius from the time of Nero. But more recent scholarship has been like, you know, no, this is 2nd century, probably anonymous literature. So, you know, be that as it. So I was careful in the book to be like, this is a chicken and the egg argument. I don't know what came first. But the Widow of Ephesus is a version of a tale that they call an Ephesian tale, which means it's kind of a story that goes back several hundred years, kind of like, you might even call it an oral story that was sort of floating around. And the more or less the plot line is, and there are a lot of these kind of plot stories that like there's always like a slutty ghost somewhere. And like all of the
this is like someone telling a story to like a ship full of sailors or something.
Yeah. There's always there's a bunch of these. And so the Widow of Ephesus is a version of that kind of narrative. And basically what goes on in the Satyricon is a version of the story where there's a widow, her husband's died. She and her attendant are in the tomb, and she's, you know, overwrought with grief and crying. And there have been 3 men crucified outside the tomb. And there's a Roman guard guarding the 3 crucified bodies because they're supposed to stay up there. They're a deterrent for everyone else. You know, crucifixion is supposed to be a deterrent from bad behavior. So he's guarding the 3 crucified bodies. He hears the widow in the tomb. He goes, he rolls back the stone, or it's already rolled back. He goes in, he sees the widow, and he tries to console her. And so they get some food, and they stay in there for 3 days and 3 nights. One thing leads to another. She gets over the death of her husband very quickly, if you know what I mean. But in the period of time when they're canoodling, so they're canoodling in the grave.
There we go. While
that's going on, the family
next to her dead husband's body, y'all.
Yeah, But she gets rid of it because one of the three men crucified, the family comes and steals him off the cross because it's not being guarded. So when the Roman soldier comes out and he realizes this has happened, the penalty for a Roman soldier under those in that situation for abandoning his post would have been death. So they take the body of the dead husband and they put him up on the cross because it's the same, decomposition, I guess, at the same time.
Yep.
And so the idea there is you're going to, make a dead man useful to save a live one is sort of the moral of the story. And they live happily ever after. So I use that as an example of the kind of narrative of the empty tomb, which Richard Miller has written a lot about, but I don't think he had that example among his other examples of empty tomb narratives or missing body narratives. There are hundreds.
My God, it's insane. I was looking at all these.
He had like 120, and I found like 35 more. It's like some kind of crazy number like that. Wow. Yeah. And so the reason I focus on the Satyricon. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Oh, well, I was just going to say, we have a delay.
No, I'm done. I'm out. It's your turn.
The reason I focus on the Satyricon is because there's also a story about this guy Trimalchio in the Satyricon, and he has a dinner for himself with his friends, and he hears a cock crow, and he thinks that means he's going to die. So he tells his friends, he's kind of a comedic figure. He always gets everything wrong. That's kind of a separate story, but so it's a satire of kind of an idealized rich guy. But he tells his friends and family to divide his body after his death and eat it. And so I was like, between the empty tomb and like the guy who has like, the funerary meal for himself, there was just like too many echoes for me to ignore. So I put that in the book.
Yeah. So that's kind of where I was going with my question that I was trying to ask before I got distracted. Given that all these like myths are circulating so broadly and are seemingly very well known, do you think that gospel authors were writing to were they trying to write something that would be familiar to the audience, or were they trying to do anything that would stand out from all these things that they probably might have heard? What do you think?
I think that they had no problem sort of filling in the blanks where they didn't have information. And so I think you want to do a few things to kind of indicate status, or, whether you want to use words like competition, you had to make the Jesus story sensible to your audience. And that is on a couple of levels. One, for people who are not already familiar with the Jesus story, so that it looks like things they've heard elsewhere, perhaps, so that it's intelligible. Then you have the factor of like, if you're a writer in the ancient world, you have to hit certain benchmarks to make your writing attractive or interesting to anybody, like for yourself as a writer, whether or not you're going to stick your name to it or not. Like for anybody to pay attention to it, it has to make sense within context. So you're going to use certain literary tools of the trade to do that. I think it does that. And then I think there's a degree to which, again, if you want to use the word competition or anything else, like when you tell a story about one of these figures, there's things people are going to expect to see. So these three like aspects kind of bleed into one another. But I think that's more or less what's going on with the Gospels. And one thing I always try to keep in tension is, not any one Gospel author has everything we might imagine we want them to have in terms of literature in front of them. So it's pretty clear, like Matthew and Luke have Mark, and that in itself is remarkable, that we can tell that this is one of their points of reference. So, I don't know what comes first, Satyricon or Gospel. I tend to think the Satyricon satirizing the Gospels in the 2nd century, but the Ephesian tale's out there, the empty tomb motif is out there. Yeah, and in general, because the Ephesian tale predates the Widow of Ephesus, but you have that kind of conflict, and I don't know everything that scholarship says about this, but Paul says Jesus was buried. But the Gospels have the empty tomb motif, which is more characteristic of literature, right? So I know John Dominic Crossan, I think, says like, yes, of course he was buried, because that was traditionally what would happen with someone who was crucified. Of course his body wasn't taken down from the cross, right? So I know that there are some scholars who have debated this. But to me, for the gospel authors to have the empty tomb motif, well, of course they would, because that's what you do when someone becomes a god, right? Like, that's why I like Calroe so much, because when he sees that his girlfriend's tomb is empty, he's like, oh, she's become a god. What god stole her from me? You know, like that's, so like these are
like, I've been married to a god this whole time.
Yeah.
You can imagine like putting yourself back in that, like in an ancient world. If you have a loved one who's buried and then you go to anoint the grave with spices 3 days later or whatever, and the body's gone, it's harder to accept that it was stolen and it is out there somewhere being scavenged. So it's probably very tempting, I'd imagine, to be like, oh, a god took them instead. It's a much more dignified thing to happen.
This guy said he was king of the Jews. He's supposed to be the Jewish Messiah. His body's now gone. I heard that the emperor's body disappeared because he had an apotheosis and he became a god. This must be what happened to, and in the ancient world, like that kind of word of mouth is really interesting. I don't like to call it oral tradition, but it's kind of an interesting, version of the same concept. One thing I always go back to is, Nero, that terrible emperor, after he died, for generations, for a few generations afterwards, people would claim that the resurrected Nero had been found in various parts around the empire, because there would be like a hot guy in like Macedonia who was really good at the lute, and someone would be like, no,
that's,
he looks kind of like Nero. But like that kind of discourse is floating around out there, and you can see how it would end up, in some of these narratives.
I love, I bring up this quote a lot when I'm arguing with Christians who like to say that Jesus is, when you're comparing these myths about Jesus to other gods, Dionysus, etc., they're like, oh, Jesus is completely different. It's a different, I like to bring this up. It's a quote from Justin Martyr during his first apology. And it's, he's writing to the emperor, who's like, we proclaim nothing, like, you believe that this God was born a virgin. That's what we believe. You believe this God was ascended to heaven. We believe the same things. Like, so it's like, we don't believe anything weird here. This is all the status quo. This is totally normal. So, So yeah, this is Tuesday in the ancient world. For things like this.
Exactly. It was just like, it was another one, like it was another one, but this one had the difference of being more tied to Judaism, which you hadn't really had before. In a time when, especially after that war, people were interested in these people who had been conquered. And people had always been interested in Jewish books, holy books and narratives, because they were ancient. So that's it.
Yeah. And they didn't have a Facebook or Twitter, so all they had was and even if they did, most of them couldn't read it. So they're listening to these stories. While you're making bricks. Hey, have you heard any stories about a new god lately? Yeah, I have.
Yeah, there's going to be something to be written, like in our time too, like, a lot, I mean, oh my God, like, a lot of people believe miracles today, but you don't, that's the kind of story that's passed on within families. That's what oral tradition is, but that doesn't always end up in literature, so but we're losing some of that with technological advances, which is interesting. I don't know if it can't still be around, but there was a newspaper when I was growing up called News of the World. And it was so great because it was like paradoxography, because it had like this tongue-in-cheek approach to the news. So I remember they had this whole series of Bat Boy Found in Cave. And so they had like this puppet, like bat child. Nobody knows what I'm talking about anymore. But like this thing has to be debunked, but I loved it.
Were these like stored like in front of like cash registers and like grocery stores?
Yes.
I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah. They have like just the most out there crazy.
He was always Bigfoot and Bat Boy. Bat Boy had like a whole series.
Aliens.
Yeah, I had a Bat Boy t-shirt. Like this thing was alien autopsies. It was so great. But it was sort of a manifestation. Yeah, and like I've done deep dives before. Like Dan Aykroyd was like way into spiritualism, and that's what gave birth to Ghostbusters. But like his family told all these stories, so he grew up with this, and like that gave us Ghostbusters. Like so. I'm always interested in how these narratives have these lives before they make it into print, because when they make it into a script or they make it into newsprint, it's a circuitous route, to that kind of different expression of the same thing. But that to me is what oral culture is. By the time it gets into print, it's a very different thing. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
One Witch Lady. I read it all the time too. I was like your grandmother. I loved News of the World. or something. What was it called? Yeah, I think it was News of the World. Can't remember.
I never read them, but I remember seeing them all the time in the grocery store.
It was the only thing I bought in the grocery store. Like my Tiger Beat. I'd get a Tiger Beat and a News of the World. And that's what brings us. God. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We have a question about plays at a church competing with the theater. I can talk about that one too. Benjamin Britton asked it. 10:05.
10:05. There you are.
Yeah, there it is. So this is wow. I'm impressed. I haven't talked about this yet. It just came out in a festschrift for Willy Braun. So I wrote
you get a gold
chapter.
Star for that.
You get a total gold. You remember more stuff than I do. So this is a piece that I wrote for a festschrift for Willy Braun, and it was on Syriac dialogue, hymns, and new comedy. So it's a version of like my shtick, comparing early Christian stuff to Greco-Roman materials. But I looked at Syriac literature, and so there was a tradition within Syria, within the church, of doing what were called dialogue hymns, and so they would be kind of like a spin-off of a famous narrative from the Gospels, for example, or through stock characters. So one would be like the penitent harlot talking to the devil, like, I hate this life I'm leading, I'm so deprived, and the devil being like, no, you're cool, and then her having sort of like the realization she shouldn't act like this anymore. There were or like Mary talking to the angel when the Annunciation happens. So there are all these different plays that we know existed in the Syriac church, where it would be this, expansion of some implied or existing dialogue between characters in the Gospels. And so what I noted in that chapter was that around the same time, we know that the church leaders in Syria had a lot of anxiety because they knew that their parishioners, if that's what you want to call them, but people in their church, were going to the theater on Sunday to watch comedies instead of coming to church. And the thing that was going on in the comedies were dialogues between stock characters who were often penitent harlots, that kind of like, comedic character. And so I argued that when you get the Syriac dialogue hymn, what it is a blatant attempt to create some kind of drama or entertainment within the church to get the parishioners back, because they're going to they're going to the movies instead of coming to church. So you have to make church more entertaining to be able to compete. Yeah. And this is at a time too when mimes were really popular. And a whole bunch of other entertainments are competing with the church. So I might put more mimes in the current book I'm writing, because everyone loves mimes. Who knew? But I've been doing more research on mimes. Yeah. Oh, I keep telling people more pop culture references from the 80s. The movie Tootsie, there's a scene where the main character's walking through must be Central Park, and there's a mime trying to balance, and he just pushes them over because he's having a bad day. So I thought of that scene repeatedly when I was writing the thing about mimes. Yeah. Oh, there are mimes in the Satyricon movie. It's all coming together.
Are there?
EC Mix knows about Weekly World News. Yeah, that was it. Weekly World News. They made a musical of Bat Boy in Boston. This was the early aughts. I made a boyfriend go to it. Yep. Oh, hold on. My earbuds are dying. You gotta switch. Can we time out for a second? Yeah, hold on.
Time out. Brief intermission. How y'all doing, chat? It's a fun conversation. I'm enjoying myself. I've got a bunch more shit I need to read tomorrow. I know that much. Not sure how much longer we're going to have Dr. Walsh. So if y'all have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will ask them when she returns. It actually. Where to put that? You're still muted. You're muted. Nope. Still muted.
How about now?
There we go. Perfect.
Okay. All right.
We made it.
We made it. I'll charge the other set just in case. Okay.
All right. So your next book, I guess we're at a good point we can transition and talk about since we're talking about adding mimes to your newest book that's coming out or we're working on. I don't know. I've heard you talk about this on another stream. I can't remember if it was Derek's or David's. But you were talking about in reference to Paul saying he knew somebody referencing himself who was caught up in the third heaven, but he can't tell anybody what he experienced. And you were saying like he felt like the moon was acting as a filter for like the spirit realm or something. I can't remember, but I'm fascinated and I want to hear more.
Okay, so this is an article that's coming out. I don't think it'll be part of the book because it's too weird.
Oh, okay.
So it's a standalone article. I wrote it. Yeah, I wrote it last summer because it occurred to me while researching for the book, and I just kind of I always run into something like that, and then I can't relax until I write it all out. So it actually got accepted by Harvard Theological Review, and they tell me it should be out in 2024. So it's coming out in an article. I sent it to Harvard Theological Review because I actually opened up talking about Lucian and a very kind of salacious passage. So I was sort of like, I will be very satisfied if they actually publish this. So hopefully, it'll come out, and they won't take it back. But what I argue in that piece is that so I've talked and I've seen a few people in the chat talk about pneuma. So it's fairly well known, I think, at this point, and I'm sure your audience knows that Paul's very much a Middle Platonist, and the early, I think the Gospel writers are as well, that Stoicism and Middle Platonism were very popular philosophical movements. And essentially, I've used this phrase, and I think it's apt, but the best science of the day really was focused on those philosophical movements. So pneuma is the word we translate as spirit and was understood as a super refined substance that was equated or associated with a high God, both in Stoicism and then certain Jewish authors like Paul, the Gospel writers, and Philo pick it up for their Greek word for spirit. And so this is the thing that, impregnates Mary. It's the thing that comes down from God and Mark's gospel at the baptism. It's what Paul says people receive at their own baptism to become, one with Christ, right? So this word, we have a very kind of a ethereal sense of what it means, sort of an impression of what spirit means in modernity. But in antiquity, it was an actual substance that could mix with human bodies because it was super refined and it was associated with things like air and wind. The example I've often given and I give to my students is, if you go out on a boat, right, and you feel the wind hitting your face and moving the boat, they thought of that as a physical but super refined invisible substance, like refined in the sense of naked to the human eye, but something material must be pushing this boat, must be pushing these waves or pushing the tree because they themselves are physical objects. So they thought that this super refined substance interacted with matter, could push matter, could change matter. So we tend to think again of spirit as sort of like the spirit. I don't know what we think it is, honestly. It has all kinds of action.
A ghost.
Yeah, I guess. Maybe because of the Trinity, people think it's the Holy Spirit, but we give it all kinds of agency. But in antiquity, they thought of it as this actual material thing. So they're all sort of, you might call them materialists. And so if you read Stoic and Middle Platonic literature, they're very much materialists. They have this kind of hierarchy of substances in their purview. And they often talk about, like different substances, what they mean. But they also, almost all of these ancient philosophers, talk about the purpose and function of the cosmos and the moon and all of this. And it makes sense, I think, because if in antiquity, the sun sets and the moon, you see it during the day too, obviously, but the moon comes out, people be like, well, what's that? If you were going to be like a philosopher or an expert or a religious specialist in antiquity, you better have a position on this thing and what it's doing and what the stars are, because people are going to be like, they know it's important. They know it's doing something.
That was up for debate back then. They didn't know.
They knew the tides were involved and the moon was associated with women's periods and stuff. They knew it had an effect, right? So in a world in which this materialism reigns supreme, they understand that these celestial objects have an effect as well, whether or not they call them the gods. I mean, we know now the planets are named after, all these Greek and Roman figures, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we're a little bit desensitized to this. And there was a book that I read for fun by a woman who's written on Lucian named Karen O'Malley. I think that's her. Let me just make sure that's her name.
I think it sounds familiar.
Yeah, here it is. Hold on, I'm going to pull it out just to give her a plug, because she's a delightful human being too, as it turns out, because I wrote her a fan letter. Karen O'Malley. Can you see the book?
Yeah.
So her last name is, it's O'Malley, but it's Gaelic, so it's spelled differently than you might expect.
I was wondering what that was.
I think she's at Johns Hopkins now. The book says she's at Exeter, but I think she's changed jobs. But I read this book for fun. And then she doesn't mention Paul or early Christianity anywhere in here. She's a classicist, so why would she? But after I read this book, she had written a book on Lucian. And so I was just kind of reading other things she's done. And I thought this was such a fun topic. What is the moon? So she really points out, to people in antiquity. And she really points out, again, how people had to have some position on what it is. So she doesn't mention early Christianity at all, because why would she? Classics rarely does. Yeah. And so I started to think do I see this kind of language anywhere in the New Testament? And so then I thought of 2 Corinthians, I know a guy who went up to the third heaven. I don't know if he was in his body or not, or what, nobody's known what that is. Then I thought about 1 Corinthians 15, where he talks about how, the moon and the stars have a different body than human bodies do. And also there's a friend of mine and a scholar named Aaron Roberts who's writing a book on this right now. Matthew, the word for epilepsy in Matthew is moon sickness, but it gets translated as epilepsy.
That's right. I knew that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I get excited when I know stuff.
No, but that's one of those weird translation issues, because people are like, wait, are they werewolves? What, what's going on? Yeah. So I realized early Christianity is steeped in this conversation as well. But once again, we don't go there because it's Christianity and it's religion and it can't possibly have anything to do with these things. But it does. These discourses are there. And think about what Paul's doing. He's striving for some kind of, position as an authority. So people must have asked him, you would ask any philosopher. So what I argue is that given everything Paul says about pneuma, given his understanding of the cosmos and his claims in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, what we know from, say, the Stoics is that they imagined after death, what would happen is your, what we would call our soul, and our nous is the word, our mind, would float up into space because it's material, the way that, spirit is material, it's pneuma, and it's more lightweight than a human body. So the human body goes into the earth to decompose, but the nous, the mind and the soul rise up because it's going to try to find its own level. The same substance that it is. It's been like helium or something, it's going to rise up to the right tier. And for most of the Stoics, their idea was that most human, well, former human, souls float around the region below the moon. And if they lived a virtuous life, the nous would separate from the soul and go into the sun, because the sun is the seat of intelligence, and the creative fire is the word that they would use. So you would basically get to live the afterlife, in Elysium, like in paradise, because your soul could fly around the cosmos and hang out on the moon, and you would be free from any worries from your mortal life. But if you were still too attached to your mortal life and the people who were on Earth, you would stay in that region below the moon. And there, in that region, he says, or the Stoics say, that the other people that you'll find there, are the entities that you'll find there, are saviors, ancestors, heroes, and daimons. And so they're all floating around that region between the Earth and the moon. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Luna, moon. Martyrs will get associated with these ideas, but it's too early for martyrs exactly. That I at least didn't see that terminology. Gotcha. So the thing I argue is that Paul.
Good.
No, go ahead.
It makes me think of was it Galatians, where they're asking Paul, what some of us have already passed on, what's going to happen to them when Jesus comes back? Yep. And he said, he's going to come get them first, and then he's going to. So it's almost like they're hovering around here, so Jesus come get them, and then he's going to come back and get us. That's I can see.
Yeah, I use every subtitle in the article is a song about the moon. So I use REM, and I use David Bowie, and so I use the idea of the Starman.
How can you not?
I basically argue. I know you have to. So I basically argue that he thinks Jesus is like the Starman, that he's going to be waiting in that region with the other saviors, and so all of these quote unquote, Jesus followers, early Christians, they're going to be in that same region, just kind of amassing with the daimons and the other characters. So when he, the messianic idea of, the Messiah is the warrior figure coming down to defeat the archons, that's your heavenly army. So they're all kind of, marshaling themselves together in those regions and the heavens between the earth and the moon. And so when the end time comes, they're going to all come down and defeat the archons. So I just try to give it a little bit more practicality, I guess, if you want to call it practical.
Have you run this theory through the book of Revelation?
Well, I think it does.
Again, with the martyrs, 144,000. Yeah.
Yeah, Paul's kind of obsessed with getting the right number of Gentiles. Well, 144, everything is divisible in Revelation. I mean, Revelation has that idea of the militaristic element, which I think is present in early Christianity. Yeah.
Wow, that is fun stuff. Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps explain how you could have a third heaven, because there are these different tiers for different beings. And
because
so
he says that in passing. It's not, he just kind of says it and then just moves on. You're like, no, wait, what do you mean a third heaven? What are you talking? It doesn't say that anywhere else. What do you mean? He just kind of says it willy-nilly.
But that's why I loved Karen's book so much, because if you read this book and you realize everybody thought there was this celestial hierarchy, and different beings go and slot into different regions below the moon. And the moon was kind of like a clearinghouse for souls. You go there first and you figure out, are you going to float down, or are your nous is going to separate and you're going to go on?
Which is why Paul says it so nonchalantly, probably because his audience is familiar with what he's talking. He doesn't need to go into and explain. They probably know what he's talking about. We don't. But yeah, interesting. Okay.
No.
So your upcoming book. I want to talk about that a little bit before you go, or before we close things out. What is that going to be about, and can I have a free copy? Just kidding.
Yes. No, you certainly can. I'm still trying to decide. I've written 3 out of the 5 chapters, but now I'm starting to doubt some of I think I want to re-argue some of it. But what I've done is kind of at first I was just going to like submit the manuscript, but now I think I'm going to actually do a proposal.
I got to rewrite this one 3
that
times
way I'm
too.
like, yeah, pretty much. But I don't want to take forever, so I'm trying to go as fast as I can. But basically, I never got a chance to answer in the first book who I thought these authors were precisely. I could talk about problems in the field, talk about how to treat them as normal authors from the ancient world, education, show how they have these intertexts, like we've talked about, like with the Satyricon, etc. But I never quite said, like, what tier of society precisely, because there are a lot of kind of compelling elements of the Gospels that make them sort of idiosyncratic, I have to admit. Things like being anonymous, questioning that aspect. Why are they writing in Koine? What do we make of the fact that the Greek isn't that elevated? And I have been pretty influenced over the last few years, always influenced by the work of Stan Stowers, although he has more material coming out most recently on philosophy and on Paul. But I'm also influenced by John Kloppenborg and by Canada Moss and a few others who... and also, I've been doing a lot of reading of theory. I like Bourdieu quite a bit, but I've also been reading some on Thorstein Veblen, and who I think also influences Fran Lebowitz, by the way, but that's a whole other story. But I think what we're looking at with these gospel authors are people who are part of, in the 1st and 2nd century, a tier of society where, because of the empire, because of increased trade, there's a class of people who are not native aristocracy, meaning they are not the Roman senators and elites that are kind of these landed families who have always been kind of part of that true elite, like imperial family tier of society. They're not senators, but they are, say, tradesmen. Trimalchio, although a satire in Lucian, fits this bill. Somebody who has kind of excess economic capital, but they don't have social capital, meaning they're rich, but they don't know how to be rich. Right. So they observe.
Sorry.
What were you going to say? No. You probably will help me.
I was going to say, they don't have the social wealth. This probably explains why they didn't identify themselves as the author, because nobody knew who they were. They had this capital and this.
They didn't have the clout, but they had the knowledge. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so
they don't
I
have
think
anything
that they're
behind
more. Yeah, they're kind of like the new rich, in other words. They'll never be Roman senators, but they have enough money to participate in the things that they see like high culture doing. So they know that if you're a Roman senator, you're supposed to have someone in your house who's like your house philosopher. You're supposed to be able to afford that, and you're supposed to be able to afford copying texts for your friends to publish them for them. And you're probably going to sponsor a library, and you're going to be a patron of making certain texts, and you're, having those texts produced, and you're going to patronize an ecclesia. So back then, ecclesia meaning kind of a social group that would have a patron deity. You'd usually have some rich person who's like the patron of that. So you would have this kind of artisan class and above who have more of this kind of economic capital, but they're never going to be super rich. They didn't get paideia, they didn't go to school, but they want to perform the same actions that they see rich people performing because they are aspiring to that. So you can't become the patron of imperial cult, but you can become the patron of this new upstart group, the Christ cult. Right. So I'm working on this idea that it's kind of like an aspirational class of the 1st and 2nd century that gravitates towards the Christ cult and sponsors it, and sponsors these texts and sponsors people like Paul, because they're sort of pantomiming what they see the true elites doing. But that would explain why the texts don't conform to the super elite tier of society, like the Virgils of the world. The emperor has to sponsor Virgil, but an upper middle class guy can sponsor Mark. You see what I mean? It's but
definitely.
They're all kind of participating in the same.
Yeah, again, we're talking about Luke. He's Luke has like access to all this information, various sources, and he's familiar with other people that are writing similar things to him, and he's writing to someone named Theophilus, whoever that may be. So like, yeah, clearly he's well connected. He's got all this information, but he doesn't put his name on the gospel that he's writing. So that's interesting.
Or it's like
a reason for that.
It's not. Yeah, or like if it had a name, it wasn't from a tier of society important enough to worry about the name, because the people who are part of the group producing it are sub-elites in a sense that like they might have the money, but they don't have the knowledge, right? So Benjamin makes a good point. The Gospels are wannabe classicists. Like I'm trying hard not to call them like wannabe, but like that is kind of it. Like the idea of being like
aspiring
money. Yeah. Aspiring like new money. So you're going to pantomime what old money does because you want to look like, it's this guy Veblen, he talks about the way that people, the way they dress or, the way that they carry themselves tend to try to project into the world. Like I'm part of a certain tier of society, even if you're not, or, like there's a way that we perform it. Yeah. So I think that the writing of the Gospels, the kind of people Paul's looking for sponsorship for, there's a certain performance, social performance going on, I think that's more characteristic of new money than old. Yeah, the Gatsby. Exactly right. Yes. No, totally. Nice. My husband is an English professor, and every single time I talk to him about this thesis,
but he'll appreciate that.
Why you're not. No, he's just like, you have to talk about Gatsby every single day. He's like, this is just the Great Gatsby. Like, just open the book with the Great Gatsby. So I've been writing. So each chapter kind of deals with looking at a different, like the Rubik's Cube of the argument is trying to elicit it in different ways. But, it's always kind of hard to convey this stuff. So I'm still figuring out the best way to do it.
Definitely. I got a question from Roland. Do you think Paul was a monotheist, or did you think other gods existed, but just trying to denigrate the ones that the Gentiles worship by saying they don't exist?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. Our category of monotheism doesn't even really work for the ancient world, honestly.
No, it does not.
It does not, because like even Paul like acknowledges other deities. He just likes his better, or if you think, that there are saviors floating around the moon, you do think that there are other kind of, extra human entities in the world. And then later on, like to call Christianity monotheism is a little bit bananas when there are like angels, or in Catholicism saints, like it doesn't work. Yep. It doesn't work. I think the difference is the idea of like one high God, for example, or like a hierarchy with, of deities. And then like the secondary question of legitimacy, because the reason Stoicism even works for ancient Judaism as a corollary is because Stoicism thought of a high God, but nobody says Stoicism is monotheistic. The category of monotheism, I think, is part of that whole romantic narrative that was basically used. It's kind of like a colonialist concept. Like, if you believe in one God, you're good. If you believe in like multiple gods, then there's a problem. And so I don't think that the categories work. And I do think that Paul just thinks the God of Abraham, the God of Jesus, the God, that he has spent his life learning about as a Pharisee, like that deity is the one true God. All of the others are inferior to that deity.
Yeah, that's fair for sure. Obviously Philippians chapter 2 comes to mind immediately. Jesus existed prior to creation with God, but was still subservient to him and was obedient to him. And then God bestowed upon him a name that was above, equal with his. So Jesus is a completely separate deity, still part of him in some sense or another, but completely distinct from him, and God like promotes him. So monotheism is a much muddier term back then than it is now.
Yeah, and I am thinking like I'm already thinking about book 3 but I want to do something that talks about, because like book 2, it's just like I have to just figure out the angle and tweak a couple things, but it exists. Book 3, I'm thinking about doing something more on romanticism, because I really loved that part of the first book, and talking about monotheism would be something I would attack, I think. But I think that the field of religious studies continues to be very, very steeped in romantic thinking in ways we're not even totally conscious about. And so I want to, there are other facets of that I'm starting to agree to talks and things like, next year, with an eye towards starting to put together a 3rd book on that. And monotheism would be one of those ideas or categories I would want to go after.
Oof. Yeah, that's a big undertaking. Good luck.
I originally wanted that to be the next book, but then for a while, I didn't think I should be the messenger on that. But I don't know, as time goes on, I just think I just really enjoyed that part of the book, going after all the Germans or the old German. I have many, many current friends in Germany, scholar friends who are quite good. So Jan Heilmann's book on authorship, if you read German, is very, very good, and book culture, Clay Mock as well. So there's a lot of good work going on there now. But the 19th century, on the other hand, 19th century, early 20th century, needs a little revision, let's say.
Well, maybe 100 years from now, people will be saying that about your book.
100%. They'll say that it needs... There's way too much Beetle / Fran Lebowitz influence here, or whatever. I can already start to see the problems with it. Yeah.
Speaking of which, kind of, I guess. Did you see Dr. Ehrman's response to your talk? Yeah, I didn't either.
Did I want to?
Is that on his blog?
He did several days later. He did a review. So I don't know what he said. I thought I probably didn't want to know. So I didn't ask to see it. Don't tell me. I don't want to know. Oh, yeah. Okay. He wrote to me this week and has asked me to write for his blog, so he can't hate me. So that's good. So I'm going to write a couple of pieces for his blog. Yeah, I think he's more of an oral. So we have a comment here about oral tradition.
Yeah, I noticed you push back on that a little bit more than other scholars about the oral tradition. So what is your take on that? Your rebuttal to your position? Do you think these writings kind of spurred up pretty quickly, or? Yeah.
So my problem with oral tradition theory is mostly when I see it invoked within the field, the premises for justifying it as a way to view the Gospels or to interpret the Gospels, I'm not always quite sure what the motivation of doing so is. Usually it has something to do with something like the historical Jesus, trying to reclaim the historical Jesus, or trying to reclaim these early Christ groups and assuming that they're there. And so my problem with that is only that those methodologies, I'm not always quite sure how well they work. So I can see Benjamin's telling me that he's more confident that we have oral tradition, but not that they are historical. I think that's an important corrective. And I don't deny that oral tradition is probably represented somewhere in the Gospels. My problem is, how do I tell which is which? How do I tell when something is an oral tradition and when something is from the creative input of the author themselves, or something that they're reading? And the other problem there too is that oral tradition sometimes can be, to our mind, literary. So think about the Ephesian tale, right? Something that authors occasionally engage those themes and turn into literature, but may have been stories that were orally told. And so to me, oral tradition becomes a very specific thing for scholars. It becomes, these are teachings or stories that we can say were passed on orally from eyewitnesses or passed over time, and we can rely on them as some form of narrative that comes not from literature and not from elite cultural producers, but comes from the common person that would be underneath that tier of society. And that kind of distinction too bothers me, because again, like oral traditions can be recorded as literature, and then that literature cited by other writers, right? Like the distinction doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So the concept of oral tradition as it's commonly employed makes more sense to me if something is in verse, if something's a poem or something's a song, then I'm with you, right? Like that is a specific kind of oral tradition that gets passed down. This is apparently what Homer was. And I know that there are cases where, scripture can be memorized orally and passed on. But again, that's a very, very specific kind of social context. And that doesn't mean now that some saying of Jesus's from 2 generations ago is oral tradition, right? So I just have a lot of problems with the slipperiness of the concept and the weight that it carries. That to me is straight out of the Romantic period. It's straight out of the Brothers Grimm. And those stories are a mess, yeah, he's saying, John D says, I'm pretty sure Bart doesn't have such a strict definition of oral tradition. He defines it as pre-existing ideas and stories. Sure, that I have zero problem with. What you'll see, though, is very quickly scholars start to turn this into, and so therefore these sayings of Jesus, I think, are right, are oral tradition. These ones are not. Like you just start that slippery slope to like making claims about the historical Jesus. That's the thing that I don't like. So I don't deny oral tradition. I don't think the Gospels are just pure literature and like nothing there is from an eyewitness or from a story that was passed on. I don't think that at all. My line on this has always just been, and it's a little bit lazy of me, but my line on this has always just been, but I don't know how to tell because I've never seen a methodology that works to identify it. And I don't know how to do it myself. And I have other things that I'm working on as an academic. Like I have other concerns as an academic and as a scholar working in this field. So, I pass the baton to whoever wants to pick that question up. But for me, like the best, I don't know how to help on that. Cause I took seminars on this in graduate school. I took a seminar with Richard Horsley, who's a scholar who's famously talked about oral tradition. And he's one of the most lovely men I've ever met. I used to sit next to him to his right every day in the seminar room and listen to him very intently because he's very passionate, very engaging, a wonderful teacher. I didn't understand a thing he was saying because he would have us read about oral poetry. And there's this guy Foley who's written How to Read an Oral Poem. And, he's done a lot of work on this. And yes, he is a Marxist. So he's very interested in reclaiming the voices of, like the lost proletariat, and it's a very noble cause. So we read all of this theory, all of this comparative literature, all this. And at the end of it, I was like, I still don't know how you see oral tradition in this. Like, I just still don't see it. I just, the Magnificat. Okay. Got it. Song. I understand, right? Like I struggle with this, and it's probably a blind spot on my part, and I admit that freely. So I look forward to other colleagues who work on this in this area to.
I think it's a good thing though. If you're not convinced of something, you're not convinced of it. I think it shows a sign of a really healthy mind to have somebody that you admire so greatly, but still like, I disagree with you. You didn't convince me. I'm not with you here. So yeah, rather than hanging on every word from somebody. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I had a few. No. But like, I always just try to have conversations with my colleagues and my mentors too. And like, sometimes they would say, like, I had this, I think I've told this story maybe, but this one professor at Harvard, I was his TA, and he was Lutheran. And so whenever he read Paul, anything that didn't sound like Luther, he'd be like, that's an interpolation. And he would like go through all texts in a seminar and be like, you can take this out and this out. He never actually said it was because he was trying to make Paul sound like Luther. I figured that out after like a couple of lectures, because I was going to have to like help, with this. And I kept being like, what is this magic trick where he knows what's an interpolation in Paul? Because he's just like crossing so much stuff out of this letter. And I was like taking these furious notes, like really focusing, trying to figure out how he knew this. And then like after a couple of weeks, I realized like, oh, because he's a Lutheran minister. And so he has to take out anything that he doesn't like. But it's like, so that's why, and I tell my students this all the time, like, don't listen to me. Like, I'm just here because I've been to school for a million years, and I like am showing you some literature and I'm guiding you. But like, even on their exams, I'm like, disagree with me as long as you can prove it. I don't care, because like, the whole point is to develop your own voice and figure out what works for you and what doesn't, to the best of your ability. So that's all I'm trying to do. And oral tradition for me just doesn't click. It's like the Scribes, oral tradition, Paul is Luther. For some reason, these things just like don't. Yeah, they don't make sense to me.
I feel the same way about the mass hallucination theory. That Paul saw like a hallucination or something. I don't have an alternate explanation. It's just not something that's really grabbed me enough for me to preach it, like it's fact. Like I feel like something else happened, I don't know.
And I try to do, my thing is to try to, as much as I can, suspend judgment and suspend like my own like editorialization. In other words, like I try to be really good about like, I just don't know. And I don't think we'll ever know. And that's too bad. Next, like trying to be okay with not knowing.
Nothing we can do with this.
Or like, they got to undig another trash heap. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
Like next, like that was one reason too with the book. I was trying to say like, let's have a different conversation, because we're just pumping out books that are like the community this, the community that, and every community is different. And I don't know why you think that they're there. Like what would it mean if they were like any other ancient author, and it's the intellectual community that's dictating the content of this stuff, not the oral tradition and not, like the proletariat, right? So, what would it mean if these are like elite dudes? Let's have a different conversation. So.
Yeah. Let's wait and see what Pioxyrhicus 5576 says whenever somebody digs it up. Then maybe there'll be more information on that, and we can move the conversation forward.
Yeah, no, that made me crazy. What was that last month when they found like, did we find a new gospel? I'm like, not every piece of trash is a new gospel. Yeah, that just makes me crazy.
So it could have just been someone's notes. I read so much on that thing. Oh my gosh.
Oh God, there was a really good. There was a couple of really good events about it, where it was, it just kind of came out like, we don't know what this is. So like, slow your roll. Like, here are some possibilities. But once again, like for me, when that thing came out, I'm like, writers, like writers write stuff. So, there's a lot, but what it shows is there's a lot of work to do in this field. It's a young field. And there's a lot of interesting questions, and I'm excited that so many people are into it, because I agree, it's like the most interesting thing in the world.
Yeah, it's what was we were talking about earlier? The debate about when early writers were saying, I'm highly educated, here's my credentials, blah, 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 blah. And then someone else is like, I didn't have any, I'm just relying on my own intuition. Today we have, for every one person who's like, I have all this education, there are 1,000 people who are like, I have intuition. And so I get so excited when like you and Dr. Moss and McClellan join TikTok. I'm like, yes, because for every one genuine scholar on TikTok, there's 1,000 people on there claiming the Holy Spirit has told them the truth. And it's like playing whack-a-mole. And it's like, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. Yeah, so it's very exciting because the people who know what they're talking about aren't the ones who like to go out in front of a camera and talk about it. Like the scientists who are studying virology are in a lab with a microscope. But all the COVID deniers are out there like screaming on the internet. So you don't hear the voices of the scientists like, no, you're stupid. Here's why.
Well, and the thing is, like, we're not any. But the only thing we have is that we've been going to school for a million years, and so we just know more about the nature of the sources, what people call the sources. Yeah. So we know like what the original Greek said. We know the history of the manuscript tradition. We know the other literature because we're all just traumatized by the amount of school we've gone through, and I'm not sure most of us know why we did it, right? Because it's not like it pays at the end of it. But it's just like, these questions were so curious. And honestly, here's where some of the people who resist like the ivory tower are correct. Like most of us either were able to withstand, like you're basically in poverty as a graduate student, or you had family who could help you, right? In one way or another. Mm-hmm. That's the only way to do it, really, is you're okay with deprivation or the other way around. Not everybody can pursue this kind of career. So we're not smarter than other people on TikTok. We just have different, a different kind of array of information to inform our position and the differences. But we've gone to school long enough to know where this stuff comes from and have gone through that discipline of disentangling it, right? Because a lot of people, I think, come from the position of like, well, and I see this with students, in this process, even in college, like, it takes especially if you're coming from that particular religious tradition, it is so hard to remove yourself from, I think I used the word situatedness before, but like, it's so hard for that class. I told you that Greco-Roman context course, like they keep on saying like, but Christianity just has to be different. It has to be special somehow. So I put a question on their exam, tell me how it is. Like everything we've looked at, tell me how it's different. And, I'm still grading and I can't really talk about like, student exams, but there's often like, I'll see like theological formulae that's more characteristic of modernity than anything that was said in antiquity. And it's this process, right? And we're all in this process where I'm trying to show them like, this thing that you're saying is from the 19th century. It's not from the first, like, to read these texts within their context, you have to do these things and forget these later interpretations. That work is so hard, and it's something even in writing that book, I had to literally put Post-it notes on my computer screen reminding me, like, I don't know that there's a Christian community there, right? Because I would slip into it too. All the time. Yeah. I went to Catholic school, I had to remind myself, like, these are the things I don't actually know. Right. And it took me 3 tries of writing the book to do it. And I'm not even sure I did it. Right. But like, it's that is a different way of thinking. That's not a way of thinking that most people are trained to do. So it's just a different discipline. And anybody can do it. Yeah. It just, it's just a lot of training and takes a lot of time.
I'll never forget, because I graduated from a Bible university with a degree in biblical theology. I'll never forget one day in class when the professor was like, the word Baalma isn't actually virgin. It just means young woman. Anyway, next part, and I was like, wait, hold on. Everybody in the class was just like, huh? And they just moved right. I was like, no, stop. What? We need to have we need to talk about that. You can't just gloss by that like you didn't just say what you just said. What do you mean? Yeah. This is the first time I'm here. I've been a Christian for 10 years. I've never heard that shit. What are you talking about right now? But no, they just gloss right past it. Like they don't even hear it. Like, how are y'all looking around my classmates? Did y'all hear what he just said?
That's why you're here now. No, the same thing. 7th grade, Sister Yvette. She said, Jesus wasn't white anyway. And I was like, what? Wait, what?
Yeah, what? Yeah,
I'm looking at the textbook. He's white in the textbook. I see the crucifix over the,
yeah.
the chalkboard.
It's clearly a
He's
picture
he's
right
jacked.
here. What do you?
Yeah, he's jacked and he's
Yeah.
white. Wait, what? And then I
Yeah.
realized, like, yeah, she's right. Then I was like, wait, what the fuck are we doing then? Like, what?
Yeah.
Why? Like, what is this? Oh,
Why does it not bother anybody the way it bothers me?
Yeah, I was like, so we're
You
just
start
gonna
feeling like
keep
you're the
doing
weird
this?
one.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
100%. And then, like, I went to high school and I was like, a typical teenager. But then when I went to college and I learned Greek, and then I was like, I think I'll start reading the New Testament, because what was that about? And then I was like, oh, like this. Wow, this field's got problems. So that's how I ended up, just because I never get tired of like the weirdness. And all these questions. There's so much to do because we perpetuate these ideas. Yeah. And it's just, what the fuck are we doing? It's like, we all know this is wrong, but we're just going to keep doing it. Okay. What?
This is going to keep me awake all night. I'm going to be up thinking about this all night. Y'all understand?
Oh yeah, no, it's still like, it boggles my mind. And so just to understand, like, okay, so what were the steps to get us to the point where we authorize X, Y, and Z, even though we know this is the wrong translation, or we know this is the wrong context, or we know this is the wrong literal, like, ethnicity of the guy. Like, we're willing to perpetuate all of this. That has nothing to do with history. It has nothing to do with antiquity. It has nothing to do with the text. That's 100%, us. And so those are the questions that I keep trying to pursue and understand, just to understand, like, this is why I will never send my child to a Christian school. Like, that was my one rule when my husband wanted to have a baby. I'm like, no Christian school. Because there's so much that gets, not that any school's okay, but you know what I'm saying? Like, in that particular instance, there's just so much, that I just, and a lot of it's pernicious. I think we need to work on this. Yeah, Miller. I think this is John D has a question about Richard Miller. Yeah.
I was seeing them in their actual historical context. I realized that I treat them as different from him. It's very hard not to, even if, Yeah, it's really hard. It's really hard. It's fun, but it's next to impossible. No, you're absolutely right. Because we still live the narratives. We're in a Judeo-Christian context in this country. Like, we're still living. We live with this in our politics. We live with it in our legal system. I can teach my classes even if people are not Christian, because they've heard the formulae one way or another, the theological formulae. We're all immersed in this. We celebrate Christmas. Like, it's inescapable, and so untangling that is really interesting. It really is. Well, we are at the 2-hour mark. I appreciate you sticking with me this long. This was a very fun conversation. I really enjoyed myself. Hope you did too.
I did.
Everyone watching, thank you guys for sticking around all this time. Again, Dr. Walsh's stuff is all in the links below. Thanks again, Dr. Walsh.
Oh, no, thank you.
I look forward to future interactions with you. I'm trying to find my outro thing. Okay, here we go. All right. Thanks again, everyone. Y'all have a wonderful night. So here's
everybody.
Quick reminder before we go that I have no idea how to
Hold on to your butts.